first, a little bit of background about urbanization in general. This is a map of the Earth at night, satellite imagery, and I want you to take from this how much urbanization is around the world and how drastically some areas are impacted by it. Areas like the eastern seaboard and parts of Europe are extremely urbanized. And I work in the Caribbean. Most of my work is in Puerto Rico. Here, where's the clicker? Yep. Well, Puerto Rico. There we go. Puerto Rico is here. And you can see that it's a very urban island. It's very brightly lit up there in that satellite imagery. And when you think of Puerto Rico, you probably think of tropical beaches. I gave away my next slide already. Yeah, there are a lot of beautiful tropical beaches in Puerto Rico. Or you might think of expansive tropical forests, and there's a lot of beautiful forests there as well. But there's also really expansive urbanization. So this is San Juan. It's a metropolitan area of more than 2 million people. There's also several other urban areas in Puerto Rico with several 100,000 people in them. And so this is really substantial urbanization for such a small island. And while you might not think of an urban area as a habitat, it really is. It's just a very drastically modified habitat. And so I want to point out a few key things, key differences between a forest and an urban area as a habitat. So this is one of my study sites. It's not a futuristic urban neighborhood in Puerto Rico. It's actually a university. But it has very many characteristics typical of an urban habitat. Two things I really want to point out are, first, notice how few trees there are. And the trees that are there are very far apart. And so one consequence is that animals that require trees, there's very minimal habitat here for them. And animals that maybe use trees need to move a long distance across open habitats. While on the ground, then, they're going to be exposed to predators and other things. The other thing I want to point out is how much impervious surface is here. So the ground is covered with pavement instead of soil or grass. And that, along with the decreased canopy cover, means it's hotter and it's more humid in these areas. There's also a significant amount of impervious surface in terms of walls. So a wall or a metal post is a very different type of structural substrate for an animal compared to a tree. They have different thermal properties, they're smoother, they're more vertical than a branching tree. And so all of these things have consequences for the animals that live in urban areas. And while that might not look like a great habitat for lizards, it turns out it actually is a really great habitat. This is a number of different Puerto Rican species that I've seen using various levels of urbanization in Puerto Rico. Anolis pulchellus, Anolis evermanni, Anolis stratulus, and on the bottom, the main animal that I focus on is Anolis chrysotellus. And these animals use urban substrates for a variety of different activities: basking, hiding in very strange spots like pipes and inside air conditioners, mating, dewlapping, interacting with each other, and even sleeping on the urban equivalent of a leaf, which turns out is a plastic bag. So Anolis chrysotellus is a really great organism to work on for urban ecology because they're found in their native range in very large abundances in both natural and urban habitats in close proximity to each other. So we can have a lot of replicated pairwise sampling across the island. Another really cool thing about Anolis is that there's this really rich literature about the morphology and physiology of these animals and how that relates to performance, how that relates to fitness, and also how these traits can adaptively change in response to environmental change. And so we can draw on all that to learn more about how these animals are changing in urban habitats. So a little bit more about urban ecology. So like I said, an urban habitat is just another type of habitat. And there are different novel selective pressures in these habitats. Now, if an animal like this lizard or this lizard is able to use this type of habitat and chooses to use this type of habitat and has the requisite morphology to use it effectively, then this sets the stage to observe rapid phenotypic changes and potentially even urban evolution. So while urban areas in general tend to be bad for a lot of species, it leads to biotic homogenization and it leads to local species extirpation, it also gives us this really cool opportunity to witness evolution in action. So the first part of my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this research that was just published in Evolution last month. In this research, I sampled 3 pairs of populations across Puerto Rico looking for these phenotypic shifts in 2 key traits. The first of those traits is limb length. So limb length in anoles we know is related to sprint speed. We know that anoles with longer limbs sprint faster, and that this maybe gives them greater stability on broader substrates as well. And this, because urban habitats are more open, like I mentioned, the trees are far apart. In fact, when we've measured nearest perch in urban areas, we've measured distances as great as 18 meters between one perch and another. And that's a really isolated habitat. In natural habitats, in contrast, we've measured most perches are only a few centimeters apart. So because the habitat is more open and because the substrates they're using, for example, walls, tend to be much broader, we hypothesized that these lizards would have longer limbs. We x-rayed them and measured their bones and found that, in fact, the urban lizards do have longer limbs than the natural lizards. And I want to point out that this is a log scale and that this is body size corrected. So this represents about a 2 to 5% difference in limb length between these pairs of populations, which are only a couple of kilometers apart. The second trait we looked at was Toepad morphology. So we know that toepads in anoles and also in geckos and some skinks enable lizards to move on smooth surfaces without the use of their claws by interactions between these specialized scales called lamellae on their toes that have setae that interact with the surfaces via van der Waals forces. We know from literature that these toepads, if they're larger, if they have more lamellae, enhances clinging ability on these substrates. Because urban areas have much smoother substrates compared to a forest, there are things like painted walls and metal. We anticipated that the urban lizards would have more lamellae compared to the natural lizards. And in fact, that is exactly what we found. All of the urban lizards had more lamellae than the natural lizards. Now the next question everyone asks is it genetic or is it plastic? So we tested that. We reared 117 common garden lizards from wild-caught urban and natural populations and found that the differences in limb lengths and lamellae number were preserved in the common garden animals. So this suggests that there is at least some genetic basis to these trait shifts. So now, why do these traits matter? Well, falls are costly for one. This lizard's trying to grab onto that smooth painted concrete, and he fails to do so. And in an urban habitat, we can hypothesize a number of situations where this could lead to selection. This animal here, he falls, he's now on the ground, exposed to predators, and needs to expend energy to get back up on that perch, and perhaps could even be injured in that fall. And in case you're thinking an urban substrate like a wall really isn't that smooth, I mean, it seems like it's probably about the same as a palm tree, we've started doing macro photography analyses of these substrates. And these are just some examples of this. Basically, to orient you to this, each pair is a single photo. The left picture is the macro photo. The right picture is the surface interpreted through image J, where luminance is interpreted as depth. And then the RA and RQ values are just metrics of surface roughness. And so basically the take home from this is the smoothest substrates in natural habitats, leaves, are still rougher than the most rough of the common urban substrates, painted concrete. And smooth metal, painted metal, extremely smooth compared to anything you find in nature. And so next we wanted to know why do these traits matter? How exactly are limb length and morphology impacting these animals? And so we built a lizard racetrack. We built it with 3 substrates. On the left here, we have painted concrete. On the middle, we have metal. And on the right, we have bark, which I built using bark from a native tree species. We ran them at 37 and 60 degrees, 4 pairs of populations, 120 animals. I just collected this data last month, but I do have some very preliminary results for you. And some videos. So, this is the 3 tracks. These are actually at angles. The top is bark, middle is metal, bottom is painted concrete, and the first thing we noticed was there are differences between substrates. Some animals run better on some than on others. So keep an eye on the top because he's going to zoom straight across. The middle does okay, and the painted concrete was the hardest for all the animals to run on. The second thing we noticed was that there was differences between individuals. So on this one, the bottom one's going to run very fast, so don't miss him. There he goes. He even stops and pauses and does not slip, whereas the top one struggles the entire way and then slides backwards when he pauses. And so when we looked at maximum velocity of these animals in this preliminary data set, we did find that across all of the substrates, the urban animals ran faster than the natural animals. And so this is consistent with this idea that longer limbs enable faster sprint speed. We also found, very cool, that on the metal substrates, this is where the differences were the greatest. And so this is consistent with the fact that perhaps these lamellae are very important here in enhancing locomotion on these surfaces. And like I said, this is a preliminary result, so hopefully once I get the rest of the 120 animals, as well as the morphology, we'll be able to tease apart some more about this, for example, what role morphology is actually playing and how morphology is correlated with this performance. Because you can imagine there's probably also a behavioral and a training component of this. So in conclusion, we did find evidence for significant differences between urban and natural populations in two functional traits in the directions predicted based on differences in habitats. We also found that phenotypic shifts were maintained in common garden, suggesting a genetic basis, although we haven't yet ruled out maternal effects. And we found preliminarily that the urban animals did run faster than the natural animals, and that this was most exaggerated on these smooth substrates. And so once I finish this data set, hopefully we'll be able to tease apart, again, these differences in morphology, how they relate to performance. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone that's helped me in the field, given me advice, and helped me take care of my animals, many of which are here today. So thank you very much. Because I ran them in the field, so I was at field stations. The body temperature, so those sprint speeds were corrected for both body temperature and body mass, both of which were significant in explaining sprint speed in my model. And overall, though, the temperature of the animals didn't vary that greatly, and other literature has shown that you can run them at different speeds as long as you correct for that. Yes?
Are you planning to look at, or have you started looking at thermal performance differences, like thermal performance curves and sprint speed, or just, you know?
I haven't looked at thermal performance and sprint speeds. I don't plan on it. There are a lot of other people that are looking at sprint speed performance related to thermal physiology in Anolis and in Anolis chrysotellus right now. And while I believe there are differences in thermal physiology, which is a project I'm working on with Shane Campbell-Staton, I'm not sure that related to sprint speed is something I'm going to get into. Anything else? Okay, thank you.